I enjoyed the rant on the Republicans, mainly because I only agree with about 50% of what you say, but I do like the way you explain things. But I had one question, and this is a pretty elementary way of looking at it, but on minimum wage, where you were talking about the $15 an hour,
right.
I've always thought, and I know this is a simplistic way of looking at it, but how can that not lead to some type of inflation? And I guess my line of thinking is you can't change the value of a service. If we hire a high school kid around our office to run errands, I can't make that service worth $15, but I can change the value of $1. Can you talk me out of that, or?
Sure. The principal way that raising the minimum wage does not principally affect inflation is twofold. The first is that wages are typically a very small part of the operating costs of a business. Now, that obviously varies from business to business, and in the service industry, wages are a much higher percentage of product cost or general operating costs than in other businesses. But typically, wages are a relatively small percentage of costs. In the fast food industry, I think they represent around 12 or 14% of costs. And so, as a consequence, if wages go up, even substantially, overall costs don't go up that much. And that's why in Denmark, McDonald's starting wage at McDonald's in Denmark is $20 an hour, but a Big Mac is 80 cents more than it is in the United States. And so that 80 cents represents that increase in wages, number one. Number two, as expenses go up in any business, the business owners are faced with a choice. Do we pass these expenses along to our customers? Do we reduce the pay that we're giving to our senior executives and the most well-paid among us? And do we reduce our dividends if we're a publicly held company that pays dividends? And typically, companies will pass along expenses last, because that reduces their competitive advantage. That's the last thing they'll do. So the first thing they'll do is reduce executive pay and reduce dividends. And so, therefore, increasing the minimum wage, that is the bottom wage that's being paid, doesn't consequentially affect inflation for those reasons, number one. And number two, the other reason why increasing the minimum wage doesn't affect inflation is because inflation happens when you've got too many dollars chasing too few goods and services. And so the value of the dollars inflation happened, yeah. And so what happens when you increase your minimum wage is that more people have an income, have wealth that they can use to buy things. And so, you could argue that might cause inflation because, you're in a situation where you're having more dollars in circulation. But the fact of the matter is that the purchasing power of average Americans right now has been so suppressed over the last 40 years with Reaganomics that, it used to be that being middle class meant that you had about a year's worth of assets that you could live on if you lost a job. It used to mean middle class meant that you had a solid couple of weeks of vacation every year, that you had a pension, that you had some retirement plans, that you could buy a house, you could buy a car. That used to be the American middle class. Now the American middle class, typically, 40% of Americans can't afford a $400 expense. 50% of Americans can't afford a $1,000 expense without going into crisis mode, right? And so what happens now when you increase wages is, instead of it throwing more money into the economy and thus having more dollars chasing the same number of goods and services, what it does is it gives people the ability to stabilize their lives somewhat. And so, again, it doesn't produce inflation. Am I making sense, Dave?